What's up, comic book fans, and welcome to Comics Icons. Now, JJ what they called me, and today, we got more Spawn. This time with King Spawn, issue number 31. And this is the first issue after the infamous Spawn 350. So all across Spawn's universe, we're seeing the effects of the new ruler of hell and the expansion of the dead zones. And if you guys need to get caught up on what I'm talking about, then you can check out the card at the top of the screen for the video for Spawn 350, where all of that went down. And I'll make sure to place a link at the end of the video as well. But if you guys are ready to find out what's next for Spawn now that he's without his powers and is spiritual public enemy number one, then you guys know what time it is. Let's get it. So this issue picks up almost a month after the events of Spawn 350. The change, as they call it, and with the expansion of the dead zones, no being that got power from heaven or hell has that power right now. So those that have been affected have been desperately trying to assert themselves. And those at the very bottom of the food chain, their only goal is to blend in or disappear. As we see one of those bottom of the food chain guys named Jimmy, while he impatiently waits for somebody. And Jimmy's chain smoked a couple of squares while he's waiting, and whoever he's waiting for can't get there quick enough. He's even forced to pull out his phone and call the people that were to be sending this guy out for him. And he tells them that the guy was supposed to be there 20 minutes ago, and you guys are always soft on him. But while Jimmy's on the call, he notices someone approaching. So he tells the people on the phone that he sees the guy now, so he hangs up on him. But as this guy gets closer, Jimmy realizes that this isn't Billy, the person that he was waiting for. And he straight up catches a couple of cracks to the jaw and goes down. As we then see Spawn now standing over Jimmy, telling him that Billy's not coming tonight. And unless you want to be buried next to him, I pay close attention to what I'm about to ask you. Then Spawn begins to interrogate Jimmy about an elderly woman with the last name Blake. But Jimmy doesn't know anything, and he swears as much. So Spawn decides to be a nice guy, and he helps him back up on his feet. But there's just one thing. Spawn still doesn't believe him, and he gives Jimmy another punch to the face, sending Jimmy night-night. So after some time passes, and Jimmy travels back to the land of the conscious, he finds himself tied to a chair in some abandoned warehouse, and Spawn has now removed his mask, showing Jimmy his face. But Jimmy still doesn't recognize him. So Spawn tells Jimmy his real name, Al Simmons, the one they call Spawn. And Spawn really wants to know where Mrs. Blake is at. I don't know, I just follow orders, Jimmy pleads. But when Spawn asks whose orders, Jimmy's reply is, just a guy. Some voice over the phone, never seen him. And again, Spawn isn't pleased with this answer. So he pulls out his blade and makes a tiny little slit on Jimmy's neck. And then he says to Jimmy, you know we've all lost our powers, right? Of course you do. I'll show you what that means. And you may not want to bleed all over yourself. And as Spawn drags Jimmy, they approach a cell. Then Spawn asks, how long you been on Earth, Jimmy? Must have come as quite a shock to find out hell's abandoned you and your kind. I know it was for me. That's why I needed to find some friends. Folks I could lean on a bit. This is one of my new pals. As Spawn then shows Jimmy a vampire that he's been keeping chained up. And tells Jimmy that this vampire hasn't eaten for a week. And I think he smells the blood from your neck. Now where's Mrs. Blake? But Jimmy still says he doesn't know. But unfortunately for Jimmy, without answers, he's of no use to Spawn, who throws Jimmy in the cell with the vampire. But as the vampire goes to lunge and attack Jimmy, his chains stop him in his tracks. Then we transition elsewhere to a week earlier in an office building, as a few evil organization types are sitting at a table discussing their current situation. And they mention a vampire lord, Blood, who's been rallying the vampires behind him, and he needs to be dealt with. And in time he will be, the leader of this group mentions. Meanwhile, it's Europe that they need to keep monitoring, especially the German faction. They made attempts to grab more influence for themselves. And Kruger was a problem even before they all turned mortal, these guys note. And he's got half-breeds in his circle. And instead of using his hellborn skills, he's now using his financial and corporate ties to get the jump on this group. And although he's recruited some of God's rogue agents, that's not the problem, since they've lost their powers too. The problem is the technology he's leaning on and unwilling to share. So this group decides to pull Kruger's military contracts and shift them to those that are more loyal. And the leader of this group knows that this will increase tension, which is why Kruger needs to be eliminated. But they're not permitted to touch one of the other heads. So the leader decides that he'll get Spawn to do it for them. They'll make Kruger the target of Spawn's wrath. Then we transition to Mrs. Blake, the woman that Spawn had been looking for, who's at a doctor's appointment, and she's just received a clean bill of health. And as she leaves out, we meet her elderly care assistant that's there to take her on her errands. So she takes Miss Blake to the grocery store and offers to help. And although Mrs. Blake is blind, she doesn't take the help. She doesn't need it. She memorized where everything is at. And we also find out that this helper named Tina is not Mrs. Blake's normal helper, as she tells Mrs. Blake that the message that she received from the elder care was that her normal assistant Linda is sick. Then Tina takes Mrs. Blake to church, and after the sermon, Mrs. Blake and all her church friends sit outside and gossip a little bit about the pastor. But as Tina and Mrs. Blake leave, Mrs. Blake realizes that Tina is going in the wrong direction. But Tina responds that it was just a detour. But then we see that Tina has taken Mrs. Blake to some unsavory types, and they tell her that her money is on the way. Then we transition back to the now, with Spawn still interrogating Jimmy about Mrs. Blake. And as Spawn tries telling Jimmy that he takes care of Mrs. Blake, Jimmy lets him know that that's why they took her. No, Jimmy, you took her. Where? You've got 5 seconds, Spawn tells Jimmy. As the vampire keeps trying to get closer and closer to Jimmy, he pleads with Spawn that he can't tell him, otherwise he'll be a dead man. But if he doesn't help Spawn right now, he's a dead man. As a chain that was holding the vampire breaks, and the vampire again lunges at Jimmy. Spawn is there to save him this time, and he clocks the vampire, knocking him back. And the vampire hisses his displeasure, but even if he did think he could beat Spawn without his powers, the vampire cowers away from those thoughts. Then Spawn focuses his efforts back on Jimmy, and he tells Jimmy that he's out of time. He needs answers now. So Jimmy finally admits that Mrs. Blake is in a warehouse in New Jersey. Then he begs for Spawn to get him out of there. But Spawn instead gives him a wooden stake for the vampire and tells Jimmy that if he wants out, then he could do it himself. As Spawn then closes the cell door, then he leaves. And we see Jimmy using that stake to drive right through the vampire. But unfortunately for Jimmy, these vampires aren't like the ones we've read about or seen on TV. And it's officially game over for Jimmy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the issue. So what did you guys think about this issue? And how about that plan by that evil Acme Corporation to screw with Spawn while blaming somebody else? Straight up cutthroat. And how about that artwork? I think this King Spawn series has some of the sickest artwork in all of comics. But you guys have been asking for Spawn, and we've got a lot more coming, so I hope you guys enjoy the ride. And I'll be anxious to hear you guys' comments on this issue and how you're feeling about this new direction that Spawn is going in right now with the new ruler of hell and no powers at the moment. Do you guys think they'll be without powers for a while? And do you even want to see them get their powers back right away? But as always, if you guys enjoyed this video and this channel and you'd like to support the channel, then you could do so by joining the Iconic Fan Club channel membership. And I'll make sure to put a link in the description to join. But with your membership, you'll gain access to weekly interactive live streams with yours truly. And we can talk about everything that's been going down in all these issues, whether it's Spawn or Fall of the House of X, or even some comic book shows like Invincible and X-Men 97. We can get into all of that. as well as stuff that you'd like for me to go over in the future. And you get a preview of the weeks to come on this channel. Plus, you guys will get loyalty badges, member shoutouts, and more in these videos. Or you guys could donate to the channel with a super thanks. And if you're not able to do either one of these, that's totally fine. You can still be a tremendous help to this channel's future by dropping a like, share, and subscribing to Comics Icons for more icons in the comic book world. But ladies and gentlemen, it's about that time.